welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 37. Joining me today is the author of various books for younger readers, including the 3 young adult series, The Pledge, The Taking, and the series we will be discussing today, The Body Finder. Hello, Kimberly Derting.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Brilliant. That's very good, and it's definitely good to hear right now.
Right.
So The Body Finder itself, book 1, was your first published novel. What was it like juggling 2 jobs, your family and your writing?
It wasn't as bad as it sounds. A lot of people think you have to have a lot of time to sit down and write. But for me, actually, I find that sometimes when I'm busier, I feel more inspired. So I would find time in snippets to write. And I do a lot of my writing. It sounds really strange, but I do a lot of my writing while I'm driving, or a lot of the processing of writing while I'm running errands. And so while I would commute, I would be thinking about the story and kind of coming up with the ideas, so that when I would find that time while my husband was doing dinner, he would take over dinner and doing the dishes and cleaning up with the kids and doing homework and everything. I would sit down at my laptop or my computer and take all of that I had accumulated during the day while I was kind of mindlessly shopping or doing whatever it was, and finally get it down on paper. So it was kind of like I was writing all day while I wasn't writing. And I think because I would have to take advantage of every minute I had, I really did take advantage of it. Whereas now that I'm a full-time writer and I have all of this time on my hands, I sometimes find myself procrastinating. And so I almost long for those days when I was so busy, I only had a half an hour here or there.
Well, that's interesting to say about how you worked in the beginning. Did that sort of method of writing, where you had to consider everything all day, did it lead to less editing?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. I think at the time, I didn't self-edit as much because I didn't know how much editing I needed. Like when I first sent my draft into the editor, it was purchased fairly quickly. So I was right on the curve of when young adult was really exploding. Twilight had just come out. So I think they were kind of making a mad dash to buy everything. So my agent didn't do a lot of editing when I sold it. It just sold very quickly. But it was funny because it really did need some editing. And my editor came back and said, you use a lot of adverbs and a lot of adjectives. And so I probably could have used some self-editing. I just didn't know it because I was still such a new-ish writer as far as publishing. I had been writing for 20 years. I wrote a horror novel when I was 20 and it was terrible, but I was still learning to write at that time. Now I spend a lot more time editing myself before I'll send something in, because I understand really what goes into the full revision process.
Well, you mentioned Twilight there.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like publishing a book kind of in the wake of Twilight?
So I will say, I know there are a lot of bashers for Twilight out there. I liked Twilight. I really enjoyed it. And I think, young adult barely existed when Twilight first came out, and it built a whole section in the library and bookstores. So what Twilight did was open that door for writers like me who really were drawn to those younger characters and the teen experience. So it was interesting because there was so much interest in young adult. And Twilight was so huge. It was, I'm sure I don't have to even say this, it was such an enormous success. Everybody wanted something like Twilight. And I had actually already written The Body Finder. I think before I had read Twilight, it was amazing to come out in that wave, but also anything that was young adult was compared to it. So there was kind of that bittersweet edge to it.
Mm-hmm. I know there are lots of trouble with Twilight. I did enjoy it, but definitely your book it's got that dark element, but it's just so different. So, we should mention the basic premise quickly. The premise of The Body Finder is that Violet Ambrose, who is a high school student in Washington state, has the ability to find dead bodies of animals and increasingly humans who have been killed, and she finds them through echoes, which is a sensory imprint that surrounds the body as well as the killer. So we've got this thriller aspect, and it rests against the backdrop of Violet's time at school and her romantic relationship with her longtime best friend Jay. Kimberly, you have a reading from the first book for us.
So the reading I'm going to do is actually from the very beginning. Violet is 8 years old and she's walking with her father through the woods. Violet Ambrose wandered away from the safety of her father as she listened to the harmony of sounds weaving delicately around her. The rustling of the leaves mingled gently with the restless calls of birds and the far-off rushing waters of the icy river that lay beyond the trees. And then there was another sound, something she couldn't quite identify yet. She was familiar enough with the meaning of this new and misplaced noise, or at least with what it signified. She had been hearing sounds or seeing colors or smelling smells like these for years, for as long as she could remember. Echoes, she called them. She looked back at her father to see if he had heard it too, even though she already knew the answer. He hadn't, of course. Only she could hear it. Only she understood what the haunting sound foretold. He walked casually behind her at his same slow and steady pace, keeping a watchful eye on his 8-year-old daughter as she ran ahead of him. The sound whistled past her again, carried on the breeze that sent crisp golden leaves swirling around her ankles. She stopped briefly to listen, but once it passed, she continued on ahead. "Don't go too far," her father dutifully called from behind her. He wasn't really worried about her out here. These were their woods. Violet had practically been raised in this forest, learning about her surroundings, learning how to tell which direction she was facing by the lichen growing on the tall tree trunks, and knowing how to tell the time of day by the position of the sun, at least on those days when the sun wasn't obscured by the gloom of cloud cover. This was an easy territory even for an 8-year-old girl. She ignored her father's warning and wandered off the path, still listening to that something that was beckoning her forward. Her feet propelled her by a will of their own as she struggled to make the sound into something coherent, something she could identify. She stepped over fallen branches and walked through a sea of fern fronds that grew up from the damp ground. "Violet," she heard her dad's voice breaking through her concentration. She paused and then called back, "I'm right here," although not as loudly as she should have before she started walking again. The sound was getting stronger, not louder, but stronger. She could feel the vibrations practically resonating beneath her skin now. This was how it was with these things. This was the way these feelings came to her. They were indescribable, yet made perfect sense. And when they called, she felt compelled to answer. She was so close now, so close she could hear a voice. That's what this echo was, a voice, single and solitary, seeking someone to answer it. Violet was that someone. She stopped at a mound of damp dirt covered with thick layer of rotting leaves. The soil was oddly out of place amid the undergrowth, with nothing living springing up from it. Even Violet knew that this soil was too newly placed to have fostered life just yet. She knelt down, feeling the pulsing echo coming from beneath. She could feel it reverberating within her veins, coursing hotly through her small body. Without waiting, Violet brushed away the leaves and debris with a sweep of her coat sleeve before she began earnestly scooping at the soft earth beneath with her hands. She heard her father's light footsteps catch up with her, and his gentle voice asking, "Find something, Vi?" She was too lost in her task to answer, and he didn't pry. He was used to this, his little girl searching out the lost souls of the forest. Without speaking, he leaned against the soaring trunk of a nearby cedar and waited without really watching. Violet felt her fingertips brush against something hard and cold, smooth and unyielding. She shuddered against a disturbing awareness that she couldn't quite name and kept digging. She sank her fingers into the moist soil once again, and again they touched something chillingly firm, something too soft to be a rock. And it was back, that nagging something that was trying to get through to her. She reached in again, this time not to dig, but to sweep away the thin layer of dirt to get a better view of what lay beneath. She had captured her father's interest, and he leaned over her, looking into the shallow hole. Violet worked like an archaeologist, carefully sifting and brushing across the top of her discovery so as not to disturb what might be buried there. She heard her father gasp at the same time she recognized what she had uncovered. She felt his strong hands reaching for her from behind, pulling her firmly by the shoulders away from the fresh dirt and gathering her into his strong, safe arms, away from the sound that was calling to her and away from the girl's face staring up from her from beneath the soil.
Was Violet's ability inspired by anything?
The idea itself came from my husband. My husband loves to come up with story ideas, and usually they're terrible ideas for the most part. I remember right before this, he had come up with an idea, and now it seems like not a bad idea. But we were driving down the street one day, and my husband said, "What if there was a summer camp and all the camp counselors were zombies?" And at the time, zombies were not really a big thing. And I said, that's a terrible idea. And actually now I look back at it and I'm like, not a bad idea. I can't remember where we were, but he one day said, and all of his ideas are usually 13-year-old boys. And he said, what if there was this kid who could find dead bodies? And I thought about it for a second. I thought, you know what? I kind of love that idea, this finding dead bodies thing. And I've always been a true crime junkie. I was a huge Silence of the Lambs fan. I love books. I hate to say it like this, but I love murder books. One of my books, the third book in the Body Finder series, The Last Echo, was kind of inspired by Ted Bundy, kind of a Ted Bundy meets Norman Bates kind of character. The fourth one was kind of Manson-esque. So I love kind of that whole genre. And so when he said this, what if there was a kid who could find dead bodies? I kind of ran with it. I thought, well, how would this person find dead bodies? And wherever we were, by the time we got home, I had this whole idea built up in my head that, of course, she would be drawn to dead bodies by whatever echo, whatever sense it calls out to her. And whatever that was, I decided would be attached to the killer as well. So it kind of grew from there. And so I have to credit him. He did come up with a pretty good idea.
He sounds like a budding co-writer in the future.
He would certainly like to think so.
Brilliant. So I'm going to look at something that you brought to the fore in your reading. Family is important to the books. Violet's family. Am I onto something here?
One of the things I really wanted was for her to have a normal nuclear family. I noticed in a lot of books, middle grade, YA, the parents are always absent. And so the kids have nobody to answer to. And I really did want this character to have kind of a realistic family life, considering her ability is so kind of not realistic. I wanted her to have to answer to parents. I wanted her to have a good relationship with her parents and to have curfews and school and to have good grades and to have that kind of normal life to balance out the fact that she was hunting for murderers.
It asks an interesting question of whether it seems more of an everyday ability or whether it is just such a juxtaposition, which is an interesting factor in itself. What is the significance of the various imprints that you chose?
They were pretty random, I would say. I wanted them to not be significant necessarily to whatever mode of murder or whatever the character's life was. I kind of joke that if I was murdered, mine would be the smell of or taste of chocolate because I eat so much chocolate, but actually I probably would go the exact opposite of that and make it decayed something just because I wanted it to not be whatever that person's favorite thing, or you know what I mean? Does that make sense? I wanted it to not have anything to do with whatever that person lived, or just very random. I wanted them to be very random.
No, yeah, it definitely makes sense. That's the reason why I asked the question, because it does seem a lot of the times random.
Mm-hmm.
You set the body finder in a real city, Buckley, and I noticed that Violet goes to a school that is also a real school, or there's a school of that name.
I live in a town one over from Buckley, It actually started with the school there. The school is set back in the woods. It's a beautiful setting. And again, I kind of like the location. This area is a perfect setting for murder. I hate to say it like that. There are woods all around, there are lakes. It's kind of nice to give it a location that is very grounded. I can drive around and say, yes, I would dump a body right there. And I think I liked that. Again, the same thing kind of like with her family. It's a very normal little town where you really wouldn't look around and say this is perfect for murder. You would look around and say this is a nice little town to raise your family. And so I decided to just set it in this picturesque little town at the base of Mount Rainier.
Fantastic. No, I know when I was reading it, I figured that Buckley was a real place, but it was the addition later on, I think it's in book 2, I want to say, when you added the farmhouse to the description of Violet's house, and that really brought something completely different into my reading of the text. Yeah, that was excellent. Going to the start again, the series, why did you start the book with Violet's feelings for Jay? You've got her feelings rather than sort of a no love triangle, and from very early on you kind of start with their relationship. Was there a reason to kind of avoid the usual tropes and things?
I think for me, I think a lot of kids, that boy next door, the way that kids kind of grow up together. And then I kind of like the idea of her just being, their best friends for so long. And then all of a sudden a summer goes by and you look at somebody differently, like they've grown up a little bit. And all of a sudden you're like, hey, you're not the same 8-year-old boy you were, you're not gangly. And all of a sudden she's looking at this boy that she's known her whole life, and he's not exactly the same person that he was a couple of months ago. And I think the one thing I really love about writing for teens is it's such an unusual time. Teenagers to me are amazing human beings. And I say that in a way that makes them sound like lumping them all together, but it's the time in your life where you're experiencing so many firsts and everything is so raw. I've raised 3 teenagers, and one of the things I love about teens is that you can have the worst day of your life and the best day of your life within a 30-minute span. And their emotions are on the surface. And, I love the idea of teenage love because it can be so fickle. I think when I was in high school, I loved every boy in my high school at one point or another. But I really wanted Violet to be this very grounded person. My oldest daughter is very grounded. She's very level-headed. She wasn't the kind of girl who said, I love you lightly. And so I like the idea of Violet being kind of that person where she knew her mind, she knew who she was, knows who she is, that the boy next door captures her attention as opposed to the hot boy that all the girls in school are attracted to, somebody that she just really, really knows.
Yeah, he's incredibly winsome as a character. I love him. And I do love their relationship, how it progresses and how you've written it and everything. So I'm going to go to something completely different now, different topic. In 3 of the books, so I think it's The Body Finder, The Last Echo and Dead Silence, that's books 1, 3 and 4, you have the narratives of the killers. You've got their plans, their movements, and it's in the first person, which I thought was really interesting on its own. Why did you include them in this kind of close-up way?
So in the first book, I did it because I liked it. Really, to be honest, I loved writing the sections from the serial killer's perspective. And I don't think I set out to do it. While I was writing it, I wrote a chapter from the serial killer's perspective. It was one of my favorite things to write. That sounds really weird, but I loved writing it. So I thought, I'm going to write a few of these. In the beginning, I wrote maybe 4 or 5 of them in the first draft. I only wrote the 4 or 5 because I thought maybe they would be cut. At the time, so that was like 2008, 2009, I thought they would be cut because it was kind of dark for that time. And I thought, if it sells, an editor's probably not going to like this. They're kind of creepy. He talks about how he's sitting in the car watching these teenage girls. He catches them, he has his bag of tricks, with the duct tape and all of his things. It's a little dark. It's kind of intense. And I'm not writing these for adults. For adults, it's not really that dark, but I was writing them for teenage girls. And so I sent it in to my editor, and the editor came back and said, okay, we really like these chapters, write more of them. And so I was so excited, because really, quite literally, my favorite chapters to write are Through the Killer's Eyes.
No, I didn't expect you to say quite that, but no, and it's fascinating, because I remember thinking that I loved how unapologetically graphic, I suppose the right word is, how unapologetically graphic you've got this, so that it reads as real and you really get a sense for the minds of these people. And then, of course, in Desires of the Dead Book 2, you kind of did something different. You looked at Megan.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a particular reason for kind of diverging from the path?
Yes, I wanted that to be a red herring. I wanted it to read as if Megan could be. So in that book, you know that somebody is potentially is a killer, and you know that somebody has left a dead cat for Violet. Spoiler alert, right? And that Violet is sensing echoes around somebody at school. And so for me to have it be the new girl Megan that you see those chapters from, I kind of wanted it to read as that Violet thinks it's Megan who is carrying the echo or the imprint.
Well, I like the extra kind of red herring that you've got, where I know at least the first chapter or two, I was thinking it was Lissy
Adams, yeah.
That was great. And then, of course, you get into it. But yeah, it was just so different to have that in it, and the things it brought to the fore through that, and her relationship with her father and everything like that. We are kind of spoiling the book, but I hope not too much. Just the right amount. So, I mean, the first book was centred pretty much solely around Violet, her friends, her family. And then Desires of the Dead, the one with Megan and Mike, sees the introduction of Sara and Rafe, which then, of course, becomes more throughout the series. Why this shift in focus?
This series is more episodic than some series. Some series, there's an arc across the entire series, so you need to read them in order. And this series is more episodic. So each book has its own arc, but you could read them out of order, because each series is its own story as well. But I really wanted to give Violet a place and a way to use her gift. I wanted her to come to terms with the fact that she has this gift and that it could be useful. So that's book one. And then I wanted to give her an outlet to use her gift. So I decided she probably needed someone, which is Sara and the group, who could bring her cases or give her a way to access cases that she could use it. Because it's, how many murders is a teenage girl from a small town just going to run up against? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's true. And the things that she's going to do, I suppose at some point you would come, not full circle, but I suppose there'd be a bit of repetition potentially in that, yeah. Was Violet always going to have her own imprint?
No, that was not always going to happen. It happened very organically while I was writing the book. So in book 3, she gets her own imprint. And I wasn't sure how she was even going to get out of the situation she was in. And while I was writing it, it happened. And I actually really liked the way it worked out. And I wasn't sure how she was going to get out of that, how she was going to resolve that she had one.
Fascinating. I was fully expecting you to say yes, in a way.
No, I don't outline everything. So even book by book, I don't always know how it's going to resolve. I knew that she was going to end up in the situation. She was going to end up captured. I didn't know how she was going to resolve that. The final resolution just ended up the way it did.
Well, I know I was wondering if Jay was going to get one at some point. If such a thing might have happened, do you think that would have been okay with Violet? Do you think she might have been able to live with someone with an imprint?
You know what? I suppose it would depend what the imprint is. Because her cat has one. And she lives with that. So I would suppose it would depend how annoying it is, because the one she ends up with is pretty annoying, right? If it's one she can stand to be around for a length of time.
Definitely hers is quite sinister in context, I think, when you think about the tune that you chose.
Mm-hmm. And just that constant, it's like people who have ringing in their ears. How much can you stand?
It did strike me a little bit like tinnitus, I think. Shall we have that second reading?
Sure. Yeah. So this second reading I chose from the final book, which is Dead Silence. And I actually chose also the prologue, which is something that happens later on in the book. Chelsea is a character who is Violet's best friend, and Jay, again, is her boyfriend. And at this point, Violet and Jay are rushing into an abandoned house to try to save Chelsea. Jay hit the door with his shoulder, but it didn't splinter beneath his weight or anything quite so dramatic. The handle, which was probably old and in disrepair anyway, fell apart on impact, and the door shot open, banging against the wall on the other side. The crashing noise filled the dark house, echoing off the walls. The sound of rushing water was stronger in here, as was the stink of urine. Violet recoiled from the smell, covering her face. She could only see fragments of the space around her, tiny pieces of the room, an old bureau with a cracked mirror, its jagged shards catching bits of light from outside and reflecting it around them, a window with dingy-looking curtains billowing in on either side of it, a mound in the center of the floor that could only be one thing. Chelsea, Violet whimpered, falling to her knees. At the same time, she caught a glimpse of another person, the killer, emerging from the darkened corner. Above his head, there was something glowing, a blur of light that Violet couldn't make out. He was moving far too quickly now. Jay, she tried to warn, but it wasn't necessary. Whoever he was already launching himself toward the open window, throwing himself over the sill just as Jay was about to reach him. And with him went both the trickling of water and the stench of old urine, two of his imprints. We did it, Violet breathed. We found her. Outside, the shrill sound of sirens came closer, and she no longer cared about anything except that they'd found Chelsea. And then, before she could stop him, before she could even shout his name, she watched as Jay, too, hurled himself over the window's ledge. She started to get up, to go to the window to see if he was okay, to see if he'd landed safely, but a hand stopped her. Chelsea. Relief rippled within Violet and spread outward. It's okay, Chelsea. I'm here now. I'm here. She heard it then, a wheezing sound, and she felt frantically for Chelsea's face, her hands stroking her friend's cheeks. It's okay, she repeated, but this time she wasn't sure. Something was wrong. She kept going, her hands searching the girl beneath her as the sirens outside grew nearer and nearer. When her hands searched Chelsea's belly, she felt something warm and sticky and wet. Her first instinct was to draw away. She didn't want to touch this, not Chelsea's blood. But that moment passed quickly, and then Violet was screaming as she heard the commotion below her, just outside the window. Help! We need help in here! She pressed her hands as hard as she could to the wound. It was all she could remember from the abbreviated first aid course they'd had in PE. She thought that maybe she should do something more, but she didn't know what that something might be. And then Chelsea went still beneath her. Not the kind of still that happens when someone falls asleep, when you continue to feel their breaths, when you know that their blood is coursing within them. No, this was a different kind of still, the kind that Violet had only seen in death, the final kind. She heard footsteps that seemed too far away, voices that were disjointed and nonsensical to her ears. Nothing made sense. Nothing was real. Hands pulled her off Chelsea, and she struggled against them, fighting to stay with her, fighting to stay at her friend's side so she could save her, to stop what was happening. But when she first saw the smoke coming up from Chelsea, from her hair, her skin, and her mouth, as insubstantial and wraith-like as the air itself, Violet realized. She knew she was too late. Heat, smoke, this was Chelsea's echo.
All your characters in this series, everyone is very distinctive, but Chelsea is particularly distinctive. She's a particular person. Was she easy to write?
She was. I really love writing Chelsea. She's kind of the smart-ass friend that you want to have your back. She's very outspoken and raw, but she's also very loyal. I really wanted girls to be friends in this book. I mean, there is one girl that's not friends with Lizzie Adams that we talked about earlier, but most of the girls are friends in this book. So as opposed to a lot of books where the girls kind of have to watch their backs and don't have a good core group, I really wanted Violet to have good girlfriends. So she has 3 or 4 really good girlfriends that she can count on. And Chelsea is one of them. Chelsea's her best friend.
The loyalty is particularly there in the last book for reasons I won't say. Question for like beyond the end of the series, would Chelsea continue to have a sort of role in this aspect of Violet's life?
So I get asked a lot if I'm going to continue the series, and I have toyed with this so many times. If I were to continue, which I do think about sometimes, I already know what Chelsea's role will be, and it would be to continue because as we find out later, Chelsea, am I spoiling this? Chelsea wakes up and has some ability, or we suspect she does. So I would like to see her continuing with Violet because she knows Violet's secret.
It's good to hear you say that because I did get to the end of the book and think, I think there's something there. But I mean, you did leave the series slightly open-ended, so it doesn't surprise me that people have asked that question.
Yeah. And I did that intentionally. I like series that wrap with a neat, tidy bow, and I like books that end where you are wondering what happens next. So I did do that with intention, partly wondering if I would write more, but partly because I do think life doesn't always tie up neat and tidy.
Mm-hmm. Are Violet and Jay going to be better at cooking than their parents, Violet in particular?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know. What do you think? They've got to be better than her mom, right?
I'd hope so, yeah. I mean, it's definitely fun what she does. You know, it's kind of every person's dream, isn't it? Takeaway and pizza.
Right. It feels like you've got to do something better for your children.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask kind of a question with 2 different paths in the road. Do you have any regrets? And also the reverse, is there anything you're particularly happy with this series?
Regrets? No, I don't think I have any regrets. I mean, maybe knowing how long there would be between if I do write another book, I might have tied it a little neater just because I do feel like there are a lot of people who feel dissatisfied with the way the 4th one ended. And I probably wouldn't have titled the 3rd book The Last Echo. There's my regret. That was an unfortunate title because a lot of people believe that was the last book in the series. There are a lot of people who never got to the 4th book because they thought the 3rd book, The Last Echo, was the last book in the series. So there's my regret for that. Things I'm happy with. Overall, I'm really proud of this series. I would say in general, I think I had mentioned that I tried to publish. I wrote a book in my early 20s, and I am very glad that book never saw the light of day as far as publishing. I would not want that one to come out Harper Lee style, like when I'm old and gray. And I just didn't have the maturity in my writing at that time. For The Body Finder to have been my first published novel, I'm really proud of that. I think that's my answer. I'm really proud of it as a series.
It was a stunning debut, definitely. But yeah, you say about The Last Echo, I remember that fondly, just, oh yes, there is another one. So we've got The Pledge and The Taking as other series to read, and I know you write books for much younger children. You've got Cece Loves Science and Libby Loves Science, but they are younger children. You've discussed obviously a potential future book of The Body Finder, but do you have any more young adult books in the planning stages at the moment?
Not young adult right now. I am actually currently writing an adult thriller, about halfway through that. So if I do write another young adult, it will probably be a continuation on The Body Finder at this point.
Is there anything you can tell us about your adult novel that you're writing?
At this point, it's very centered on dysfunctional parental relationships. Like I said, I'm a true crime junkie. One of the things I really love is exploring the way that children can be mistreated and abused, and they still keep coming back or staying with their parents. And so it's very focused on it's not abused children, but it's children who are emotionally and psychologically traumatized. And it's a mother-daughter who just, this mother is horrible to her daughter, and the daughter just cannot break away. And she wants to be the exact opposite of her mother and tries to raise, create a family. And just the way that she just ends up coming full circle and can't seem to break the bond with her mother.
That sounds very different to, well, certainly the Body Finder, but yes, that will be interesting to see where that goes. It does sound very, very good. So, listeners, links to purchase the Body Finder, all 4 books, are in the episode description, and that is along with my email address. If you have enjoyed this episode, do subscribe or follow the podcast for future episodes. And Kimberly, it's been absolutely fantastic having you today. It's a series that was published a while back, but it has been fantastic to reread it. It's been a wonderful experience. And talking to you today, it's kind of the stuff of dreams in a way of my reader self several years ago. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
The next episode will be on Monday, the 24th of May. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 37, was recorded on the 26th of April and published on the 10th of May 2021. Music and production by Charlie Place.